Teoscar Hernández has seen a lot of things inside a major league clubhouse. He has seen players ice their arms for 45 minutes after a game and still not sleep that night. He has seen veterans wrap themselves in so many layers of treatment protocol that they look less like baseball players and more like something assembled in a laboratory. He has seen trainers, physical therapists, nutritionists, sleep coaches, and recovery specialists cycle through clubhouses in every city in this league. He has spent 15 years watching professional athletes do everything humanly possible to keep their bodies functional in a sport that is relentlessly, quietly, brutally physical. And then he walked past Shohei Ohtani's locker one morning. And he stopped. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked. And then, according to the people who were in that room, Teoscar Hernández, a man who is not easily impressed, a man who has shared a clubhouse with some of the best players on the planet, shook his head slowly and said something that has been repeating itself in conversations around the Dodgers organization ever since. "I didn't know you could do it like that." What he saw that morning is the subject of this story. What he didn't know, what even the Dodgers front office, with all their sports science resources and all their medical staff and all their analytics, didn't fully understand until recently, is the reason why Shohei Ohtani keeps coming back. Keeps recovering. Keeps defying the math of human durability in a sport that has broken bodies far less complicated than his. This is not a story about baseball statistics. This is a story about what happens when an elite athlete decides that recovery is not a passive process. That healing is not something you wait for. That the body, treated correctly, is not a machine that wears down, it is a system that, if you understand it deeply enough, can be made to rebuild itself stronger than it was before. Shohei Ohtani understood this before most of the people around him did. And the hospital visit changed everything about how the Dodgers see him now. The Dodgers did not send Ohtani to the hospital because something was wrong. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the detail that reframes everything that follows. This was not a panic visit. This was not the kind of medical situation that gets reported in cautious, carefully worded press releases that say, day to day, when everyone knows it means something longer. This was not the story of an injury. Ohtani had requested the visit himself. He had questions, specific, technical, deeply researched questions, about the physiological mechanisms behind tendon recovery in high-velocity throwing athletes. He wanted to speak directly with the specialists. He wanted to understand not just what was happening inside his body, but why it was happening, and what the precise conditions were under which the recovery process could be optimized. The medical staff who received him described the experience as unusual. Not uncomfortable. Not alarming. Just unusual. Because athletes, even elite athletes, generally come to medical appointments as patients. They describe symptoms. They answer questions. They receive information and then go back to doing what they were told. The dynamic is clear. The roles are defined. The doctor leads, and the athlete follows. Ohtani arrived with notes. He had written things down. Specific terminology. References to studies he had apparently read. Questions that demonstrated not just a casual interest but a genuine, sustained engagement with the science of his own body. One of the specialists in the room that day later described it to a colleague as feeling less like a medical consultation and more like a conversation between two people who had both done their homework. When that description eventually filtered back through the Dodgers organization, it landed with a particular weight. Because the Dodgers, more than almost any other franchise in professional sports, have invested in sports science. They have the staff. They have the technology. They have the infrastructure. And yet here was their most important player arriving at a hospital with notes in his hand, asking questions that some of their own people hadn't thought to ask yet. That was the moment the words started being used inside the organization. Professor. Let's go back to that morning. Back to the locker. Back to the moment Teoscar Hernández stopped walking. What he saw was not dramatic. That is the strange thing about it. From a distance, it would have looked almost ordinary, just a player engaged in some kind of pre-activity preparation. But the details, when you understood them, were not ordinary at all. Ohtani had constructed what can only be described as a personal recovery architecture around his daily routine. Not the standard foam roller and resistance band setup that most players use. Not the generic protocol handed down by a team trainer and followed with varying degrees of compliance. Something else entirely. Something layered, sequenced, and precise in a way that suggested it had been developed over years of observation, adjustment, and refinement. There was a thermal element, specific temperatures applied to specific areas of the arm in a sequence that Ohtani had determined through his own testing. There was a breathing pattern, not relaxation breathing, but something more structured, designed to influence blood flow and tissue oxygenation during the recovery window. There was a nutritional component that happened at a specific time in relation to his physical activity, not before, not after in the general sense, but at a precise interval that he had calculated mattered. And there was something else. Something that Hernandez described later, in a conversation that was not meant to be public but became part of the story anyway. He talks to himself during it. Not loud. Quiet. Like he's running through a checklist in his head. But you can see his lips moving. And when he's done, he just nods. Like he confirmed something. That image. A man nodding to himself, alone, confirming something that only he can verify, inside a process that only he fully understands. That is the image that captures what separates Shohei Ohtani's approach to his body from almost everyone else in professional baseball. He is not following a program. He is running one. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Ohtani's body has actually been through. The list is not short. Tommy John surgery in 2018. The long rehabilitation that followed, not just physically but psychologically, because there is a particular kind of patience required to rebuild an arm from the most fundamental level and trust that what comes back will be as good as what existed before. The oblique strain. The knee surgery in 2023. The second Tommy John procedure in the same year, performed not because something catastrophically failed, but because the original repair had reached the limits of what it could sustain under the demands of elite two-way baseball. Any one of those injuries, in isolation, represents a serious threat to a professional baseball career. Together, they represent something that most medical professionals would look at and describe, carefully, as a challenging road. And yet, Ohtani returned from Tommy John the first time and was better than before. His velocity went up. His secondary pitches became sharper. The arm he brought back from rehabilitation outperformed the arm he'd had before the injury in measurable, documented ways. Then he returned from the second surgery and, in his first outing back on a major league mound in 2025, threw 5 scoreless innings against a team that had prepared specifically for him. The Dodgers medical staff wanted to understand how. Not in the vague, appreciative sense that people use when they call someone resilient. In the specific, technical, reproducible sense that a sports science team uses when they identify a variable that is producing outcomes they want to understand and potentially replicate. They wanted to know what Ohtani was doing, precisely, that was generating recovery results that were exceeding their projections. The hospital visit was part of that investigation. What emerged from it was not a single secret. It was a framework, a philosophy of recovery that Ohtani had been quietly building and refining for the better part of a decade, informed by conversations with specialists in Japan long before he ever arrived in Major League Baseball, and continuously updated through his own research and observation. The core of it, described in simplified terms, is this: Ohtani does not treat his body as something that needs to be protected from stress. He treats it as something that needs to be exposed to the right kind of stress, in the right sequence, at the right intensity, so that it adapts continuously rather than simply maintaining. This sounds simple. It is not simple. The distinction between stress that damages and stress that develops is one of the most complex and individualized problems in sports medicine. Get it wrong in one direction and you're injured. Get it wrong in the other and you're underprepared. The window where it's right is narrow, and it moves depending on variables, sleep quality, nutritional status, training load from previous days, atmospheric conditions, psychological state, that most athletes don't track with any precision. Ohtani tracks all of it. Here is where the story becomes most interesting. The Los Angeles Dodgers are one of the most technologically sophisticated organizations in professional sports. They have invested in biometric monitoring, in sleep science, in nutritional optimization, in every measurable dimension of athlete performance and recovery that modern sports science has identified as relevant. They brought that entire infrastructure to bear on Shohei Ohtani the moment he signed his $700 million contract. And they discovered, piece by piece, that he already knew things they didn't know. This was not a comfortable realization for a front office that prides itself on information advantage. But it was an honest one. Multiple members of the Dodgers' performance staff have privately acknowledged that working with Ohtani has changed how they think about certain aspects of recovery protocol, not because he told them they were wrong, but because the outcomes his approach was producing were simply better than what their standard protocols were generating, and the data eventually forced them to ask why. One specific area where this became most visible was the management of his throwing program between starts. The conventional wisdom in Major League Baseball, the wisdom that has governed how starting pitchers are maintained between outings for decades, involves a structured reduction in throwing intensity in the days immediately following a start, followed by a gradual build-up leading back to the next outing. The logic is intuitive. You've stressed the arm. Now let it rest. Ohtani's approach to the days after a start is different in ways that the Dodgers initially questioned and eventually stopped questioning. He does not fully rest the arm. He maintains a specific level of neuromuscular engagement, a carefully calibrated stimulus designed to keep the tissue communicating, keep the patterns sharp, prevent the kind of stiffness and compensatory tightness that can develop when a heavily used arm is simply left alone. It is the difference between active recovery and passive recovery, taken to a level of specificity that most pitchers never reach. When the Dodgers staff analyzed the data from his previous seasons, looking at his arm health metrics, his velocity consistency, his injury frequency relative to innings pitched, the pattern was clear. His arm was not declining the way a heavily used arm typically declines. It was maintained. In some metrics, over some periods, it was improving. The hospital visit confirmed what the data was suggesting. Ohtani is not just an outlier in terms of talent. He is an outlier in terms of methodology. And the methodology is not accidental. It is the product of years of deliberate, disciplined, intellectually serious work on understanding a body that was asked to do something nobody in the history of professional baseball had been asked to do. Teoscar Hernández is not the only Dodger who has noticed. Freddie Freeman, who has played professional baseball for 15 years and has seen everything, has mentioned in conversations that Ohtani's daily preparation routine is unlike anything he has observed. Freeman is not an easily impressed man. He won a World Series MVP. He came back from an ankle injury that threatened his participation in the most important games of his career and performed at a level that defied medical logic. He knows something about preparation and resilience. But he described watching Ohtani work as educational. Dave Roberts, who has managed some of the most talented rosters in modern baseball history, has been asked multiple times about the nickname. About Professor Ohtani. He does not dismiss it. He does not laugh it off as media mythology. He answers the question with the particular care of a manager who has learned that when it comes to Shohei Ohtani, the things that sound like exaggeration usually turn out to be accurate. There's a reason we trust him to know his body, Roberts said, in a press availability that passed without much fanfare but contained one of the most revealing things he has said about Ohtani all season. Most players, you work with them, and you're managing their body on their behalf. With Shohei, it's a conversation. He brings information to it. And honestly, that information has been right. That last sentence. That information has been right. In professional sports, where the information hierarchy flows from organization to athlete and rarely in the other direction, a manager saying that a player's self-generated information has been consistently accurate is an extraordinary acknowledgement. It means that Ohtani has built enough of a track record, through enough seasons and recoveries and returns, that the people responsible for managing him have learned to listen. That is what a professor does. Not lectures. Not insists. Just presents information that is consistently accurate, until the people around him adjust to receiving it. There is a version of this story that is simply about one exceptional person doing exceptional things. And that version is true. Ohtani is exceptional. The things he does are exceptional. There is no instruction manual that produces a Shohei Ohtani, and the honest answer to the question of how he keeps recovering and returning and dominating is that some significant portion of it is simply him, his genetics, his psychology, his specific combination of physical gifts and mental discipline. But there is another version of this story that is more important. Because what Ohtani's approach to recovery represents is not just individual genius. It is a possibility. It is evidence that the relationship between an elite athlete and his own body can be something more active, more informed, and more productive than the professional sports model has traditionally assumed. It is a demonstration that an athlete who invests in understanding, genuinely understanding, at a technical level, the systems that govern his physical performance, can achieve outcomes that look like miracles but are actually, at their root, the product of superior information and superior discipline. The Dodgers now know this. Their medical staff has been changed by the experience of working with him. Some of the protocols they use with other pitchers have been adjusted, quietly, in directions that Ohtani's approach suggested. Not copied wholesale. Nothing about what Ohtani does can be simply lifted and applied to a different body with different history and different demands. But influenced. Informed. Made better by proximity to a mind that approached the same problems from a different and ultimately more productive angle. That influence will outlast his time in a Dodgers uniform. It already has. Let's go back to the locker one final time. In the morning. To Teoscar Hernández standing still in a moving clubhouse, watching something he hadn't expected to see. What he saw was a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that his body was not a mystery. That it was not something to be handed over to specialists and trusted blindly, nor something to be pushed through on willpower alone. It was a system. It could be studied. It could be understood. And if you understood it well enough, if you asked the right questions, read the right material, spoke to the right people, and then actually applied what you learned, consistently, every single day, in the quiet spaces before and after the games that everyone watches, it could be made to do things that looked, from the outside, like they shouldn't be possible. Ohtani finished his routine. Ran through his checklist, internal, invisible, entirely his own. And nodded. The confirmation of something only he could verify, at the end of a process that most people around him still don't fully understand. A professor, alone with his work, satisfied that the lesson has been correctly applied. He picked up his glove. He walked toward the field. And somewhere behind him, Teoscar Hernández, a 15-year veteran, seen everything, not easily impressed, was still standing there, shaking his head slowly. I didn't know you could do it like that. Now you do.